All right, with this, we're going to get started. This is Connor Everts. I am your co-chair and moderator today. I'm with the Southern California Watershed Alliance, and Dee Zink, who's normally with us, won't be here today. She will be back at our next dialogue. So I will be moderating the questions and answers after the presentations as well. This is our fourth virtual meeting. We hope you find our Zoom approach close to as effective as our old in-person meetings used to be. But bear with us. We do practice, but all of this is thanks to our steering committee, our technical team, Dee Zink and her MWD staff who've made this webinar happen. And of course, our coordinator, Kathy Caldwell, whose perseverance has kept us going. We have a few webinar ground rules. When we used to meet in person, we go around the room, everyone would give a quick introduction and state their affiliation. With the Zoom webinar, we're not able to do that, unfortunately, in this format. So you won't be able to see a list like you may in some other Zoom presentations of the people, but we have over 100 people at this time. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature to let us know. Joanne Carrillo, who sent out the email with the connection, will respond to you. You'll be muted during the webinar, but can interact during the question and answer feature. Type in a question and hit send. Questions can be sent anytime during the meeting, but will be answered after the presentation. If you're experiencing a poor connection, try moving closer to your router or turning off the video. Presentation will run about 30 minutes and it'll be followed by, we hope, a lively dialogue or question and answer session. We really stress that we can try to get everybody in. We may consolidate some questions if people send in multiple questions from the same person, just so you know, or if there are a few questions that are exactly the same. Today, we have, and you're seeing a series of slides verifying how to do this, and I will review those again when we start at the end of the presentations. So today, from the Metropolitan Water District, we have Nadia, who will be our speaker, and Dimitri and Brandon Goshi, who will be available for questions and answers, and as resource people as well. The question and answers will go until 1:30 p.m., just so you know. So get ready, and we're off. Dimitri and Nadia, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about Metropolitan's Integrated Water Resources Plan. A quick overview for this presentation. Today, I will talk about what is the Integrated Water Resources Plan, known as the IRP, the history of the IRP, what is scenario planning, and then I'll provide a current progress and schedule for our upcoming IRP. So what is the Integrated Water Resources Plan, known as the IRP? The IRP is a long-term strategy that adapts to changing conditions. It looked at building upon its imported water and leveraging those investments with transfers and exchanges. We also diversify our water portfolio to look at what we can do locally to ensure water reliability in the future. So we all know here in the West, our hydrologic conditions can shift dramatically, but our economy still needs to depend on a steady and reliable water supply. The drought that came in the late 80s, early 90s led to significant water supply challenges for California. So this prompted a complete rethinking of our water management programs, investments, and planning objectives. The drought of 1991 basically was the driving force for Metropolitan to develop our very first long-term water vision, which is what we call today the IRP. The cutbacks on the Colorado River that happened in the early 2000s led us to our 2004 IRP. Reduced reliability from Northern California due to regulatory restrictions led to our 2010 IRP, and extreme hydrologic events like the unprecedented drought in 2014-15 and an economic downturn led to our 2015 IRP. So the IRP sets a planning horizon for 25 years, and it is updated nearly every 5 years. The IRP has helped the region face and meet the challenges of the last 25 years. So most were things that we could have never imagined happening. As you can see here in this graph, since 1985, metropolitan service area population has been increasing steadily, and yet our potable consumptive water demand remains somewhat the same. What this graph also says is that Southern Californians have done a great job conserving water, and overall water demands on Metropolitan have stayed relatively flat during this time. So in the past, the way we've approached our planning is with single line forecast. But for Southern California, because of climate change and environmental concerns, both of our Colorado River and State Water Project water supplies face reliability challenges. We also know that local sources are not immune to these challenges. So although we've been doing a great job, I think the one thing we can definitely learn from last year is that the future is not certain. I don't think anyone ever expected COVID. I would also say that most of Texans probably did not expect the deep freeze ever occurring in their state. So we recognize that we face a lot of uncertainties, whether it's the climate, infrastructure, regulatory, economy, technology, demographics. We definitely can't predict the future. This is why Metropolitan chose to do scenario planning approach for our next IRP. Scenarios are not predictions of the future, but scenarios help people explore and learn from possibilities of what could happen in the future. This is why when we ask what if questions, when we try to stretch our imagination and challenge our perception, it can help us explore of what the future might look like and the likely challenges of living in it. So what is scenario planning for Metropolitan? For us, it is to identify uncertainties and trends that are outside of our control that can have significant impact to water supply reliability to region. This is so that we can be responsive, resilient, and effective as the future becomes reality. Here's a roadmap of what the 2020 IRP scenario planning looks like. We first start identifying drivers of change, which we've completed this step. And then we will construct learning scenarios, follow with developing resource mix. And then at the end, we will come up with an adaptive management strategy. I'm going to dive into a little more detail into each of the steps. So the first one, step one, we need to identify drivers of change. To identify these drivers of change, we held several brainstorming sessions. We started the brainstorm internally with Metropolitan staff, and then we also had workshops with our member agencies, our board directors, as well as the public. We identified and listed the most uncertain things that we think will have most impact that are beyond our control. So from these brainstorming sessions, we were able to list a bunch of drivers. And these are just some examples. For example, sea level rise. Could be how quickly sea level rise does or doesn't happen. because this could threaten infrastructures along the coast. Another one is rainfall. How much or how little our rainfall changes here in Southern California, and how will it impact our groundwater basin? Another one could be how slowly or quickly rising temperatures and declining snowpack translate to less water into the Colorado River. We simply don't know about our future economy. Are we heading into a recession or any economic upturn? We don't know what the public's willingness to invest in water solution or their ability to pay for water in the future. In recent years, Southern California has overestimated population growth, and this led to an overestimation of future demand. So the accuracy of future population projection will have an unknown and also a significant impact. We could perhaps see the cost of new technologies go down, processes become more economical and acceptable. There may be new approaches that expand stormwater in the future, increasing investments in landscape improvements. With emerging contaminants, regulations could be expanded, detections limits reduced, and making it harder and more costly to treat water. Perhaps there could be a rebalance of the beneficial uses in the Delta that could reduce imported water from Southern California. So we listed out many of these drivers, and we generally saw that these drivers fell into these categories. For example, the sea level rise, rainfall, and rising temperature fall into the climate change. The economic conditions and population growth fall into economy and demographics. The new technologies and stormwater expansions, they fall into the technological advances, and emerging contaminants and delta issues, they would fall into politics and regulations. From the workshops, we also asked different cohorts to rank drivers, and these were the top 5 survey rankings based on responses that were extremely or very important for them. You can see here a couple of drivers that concern all 3 of them, drivers like hydrologic variations and direct potable reuse. Groundwater contamination is top 5 for member agencies and stakeholders. Outages and disasters are top 5 for board members and stakeholders. But I think the most interesting part in this is that how these different cohorts with different priorities basically come up with the same top 5. So step 2, after we identified these drivers, we then created a framework. This framework focuses on imported supply stability and demand on Metropolitan. On the x-axis, we have high demand on MET and low demand on MET. And on the y-axis, we have greater imported supply stability and low imported supply stability. And so this framework basically helped us create the 4 scenarios you see on the screen. Scenarios A, B, C, and D. Scenario A with low demand and stable imports, and the opposite, scenario D, which is a scenario with high demand and reduced imports. So you must be wondering what these scenarios are. So to help you paint a better picture of what each scenario look like, I will go through each of this scenario with you. So the first one, scenario A. In this future, we're assuming slow growing economy. So most likely means lower water demand. We expect to have the least additional supply needed for this scenario and fewest local supply needed as well. By stable imports, we assume gradual climate impacts. For scenario B, what is different in this future is that we have higher demand. So we assume faster growing economy. And because of this, we should expect to have additional supply for growing demands. And also, we can also assume additional local projects will be needed as well. Again, for stable imports, we still assume the same gradual climate impacts. For scenario C, now in this future, we have low demands and reduced imports. So in the first scenario, we assume slower growing economy causes low demand. Because of this future may have the least additional supply needed. The local supply may still be developed, but we will still need to prioritize the projects with least investments. Reduced imports will have severe climate impacts and higher regulatory requirements. Last one, but definitely not the least, this scenario D. In this future, we can assume faster growing economy because of high demand. So most additional supply is needed and most local projects will be developed. However, in this future, again, because of reduced imported supply, it will have severe climate impacts with higher regulatory requirements. So for step 3, we're going to develop actions to address each of these scenarios. So what do I mean by that? So each of these scenarios will have a supply and demand gap. Some may be smaller and some may be larger, but there is going to be a range of supply and demand gaps for each of these scenarios. So we're going to need to develop actions to shrink that gap to make sure we're reliable. And as directed by our board, Metropolitan's working goal is to be 100% reliable. So what that means is that we need to have zero supply and demand gap. And how do we do that? We will start by identifying common actions. This will be the basis for the 2020 IRP. You can think of these common actions as the no regret actions. They all work for different scenarios. Common actions could be a certain target of conservations. We can all agree conservations, demand management actions is important for the region. Some of these scenarios may be more challenging, so we can come up with more supply or more demand management targets. So what makes the scenario different from one another will be the unique actions in order to be reliable for each scenarios. These unique actions form the basis of adaptive management. How do we know when we need these unique actions? So first we'll need to identify signposts. So basically, these are things we need to pay attention to, like increase in temperature, increase in population, or decrease in watershed. So these are just some potential signposts. So after you've identified the signposts, then we can apply the adaptive management. Basically, it's knowing what to look for, when to look for it, so we can implement these unique actions. So for example, some scenarios may cause larger gaps. So we would need to take more unique actions like implementing specific local projects. So having these scenarios with action plans will make us more prepared for the uncertainties we face in the future. So today, we're currently refining our scenario assumptions. It's a collaborative and iterative process. So we first started gathering member agency input, and then we did research and confirmation, and we are currently working with a few expert consultants. All of these inputs we gather will feed into our modeling for gap analysis, and then the result will be brought to inform board policy discussion. So as we do our assumption refinements, these refinements will be grouped into these 3 areas: demands, imported supply, State Water Project and Colorado River; local supply, which consists of groundwater, local projects, surface water, and the LA Aqueduct. So with demand refinements, we've gathered inputs from member agency, technical staff, and managers. Currently, we're working with a few demand experts to help us with our demand assumptions. As part of the engagement, we met staff. We asked for feedback and inputs as we refine our assumptions. And then at the end, we plan on having the expert provide us a written assessment of our scenario assumptions. In March, Metropolitan is going to hold a workshop with board members, member agencies, and our expert consultants to discuss the impact on scenario planning and adaptive management component for this IRP. So this is basically an opportunity for our board members and member agencies to ask clarifying questions directly to the demand experts. With the imported water supply refinements, the process is very similar with our demands refinements. Again, we've gathered inputs from member agency technical staff and managers. And because this is for our imported water supply refinements, we are currently working with a few climate experts, again, asking questions, seeking feedback as we refine our assumptions. And for this supply refinement, MET is going to hold a similar workshop with board members, member agencies, and our expert consultants, but this will be in April. Again, this is going to be an opportunity for our board and member agency to ask clarifying questions directly to our climate experts. With local supply refinements, the process is a little bit different than our previous refinements. We're currently engaging with member agency technical staff and manager for these 4 groups of local supplies. We're in the process of creating scenario-specific project inventory and developing new projection technology, methodology. This refined local projections will help our gap analysis. In addition, we'll also be working with our climate experts to help with our assumptions. So here's our tentative schedule. You can see here that there is an overlap between each of this step. This is because it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to fully complete each step to start the next one. We can start the process, the following step, as we finish the previous step. So in this tentative schedule, the target for Metropolitan to adopt the IRP will be in September. This concludes my presentation. So before we open it up for questions, I'd like to ask you all, do you have any feedback for our scenarios? What did you notice, the general differences between scenarios? Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the IRP, and my managers, Brandon and Dimitri, and I are here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Natty. With that, we're going to go to the question and answers. I had just one brief one, if I could ask. So when you mentioned the upcoming board workshops and meetings, those are available for the public as well too, correct?
So I'll go ahead and take that one. So the current thinking is that, and we're still developing how we're going to roll this out, but the current thinking is that we would, this would be part of the IRP committee. So as with any committee meeting at Metropolitan, there is a, the public can listen in and also ask questions at the beginning of the meeting. So there would be an opportunity there to share any thoughts. But we are planning to, subsequent to the development of the refined scenarios and the assumptions, to hold a public workshop as well. And that would be another opportunity for the public, similar to what we did, if folks recall, back in May of last year. And I think we held 2 public workshops there when we were developing the drivers. So our intent is to, once we're past the seconds, or once we've completed or shaping the scenarios, we would have our next round of public workshops.
Thank you, Dimitri. All right, with that, we're going to start our question and answer period, which is our dialogue. And we're going to go through a process on how to answer a question. So on your screen, whatever type of screen, I've got an iPad and an iPhone running here. You may be on a computer. There's a Q&A button, either at the bottom or the top. Please type in your questions. We're only taking written questions. And then you can upvote or thumbs up. If two questions are similar or combined, that will move them up on the queue, those questions. And then we will, at 1:30 again, get to our closing remarks, and we're going to try to get everybody's questions in. We've got a shorter presentation, but more opportunity for a dialogue. So with that, and I see there's some questions coming in through. Okay. All right. Number one on our list. Charming Evelyn from Sierra Club Angeles chapter and head of the Conservation Water Committees asked, our direct potable reuse regulation was not mentioned under a driver of change and yet is extremely important, and she wants to know why.
So I think I'll go ahead. Our intent is all types of regulations would be captured in the scenarios there. As you saw in the scenarios that had higher climate change impacts and lower climate change impacts, we kind of coupled that with higher regulatory requirements and lower regulatory requirements. So we would be grouping these things, all types of regulatory requirements in there. So and DPR would certainly fit in within that. So if it wasn't specifically mentioned here, there were a lot of drivers and we didn't have space on a screen to put them there, but those are things that we would consider. So each of these futures, we would ask ourselves what would lend to the development of, or would it be easier to develop these sorts of programs in this future or not? So that would be considered in the analysis.
Great, thank you, Dimitri. Okay, I see Charming's been busy here. So she also wanted to know that you mentioned beneficial uses of Delta resources, yet there's been no mention of actually improving Delta, the Bay Delta estuary health. What are actions being taken to improve Bay Delta estuary health?
So specifically on actions taken are not necessarily part of, I believe, the IRP process, but the district and our Bay Delta folks are certainly more involved and better suited, I think, to address those. I don't know if others on the team here have thoughts on that, but.
You know, I guess I just add that in so much as approaches to address the issues in the Delta would be identified through the different conditions and the outcomes that affect the Delta through the different scenarios, we would address it that way.
Thanks, Brandon. All right. Martha Davis, thank you for joining. In making demand estimates, what water use factors were used? Historically, MWD relied on MWD main for the water use factors. Did MWD use MWD main in the urban water management plan and the IRP demand projections? And then the second part of that question was the MWD main updated for this purpose? And when was it last updated? And maybe you can explain a little bit what it is. Do you want to take that, Brandon?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Martha, how are you doing? A lot of questions in one question, but they're all related. And so let me try and get through this. By the way, I really like how the questions are written here, because then I can remember what the actual question is when I'm answering it. So water use factors, what we think of as water use factors have been historically been measured, as you said in your question, by econometric models, right? So what we think of as water use factors are coefficients within a model. And so we are using as a basis for quantifying changes the MWD EDM model, which is a newer rendition of the econometric models that were developed and we know of as MWD main. One of the processes that we're going through, which is kind of innovative, I think, but also very challenging, is to try and consider, through the differences in the underlying drivers and conditions for each scenario, how the underlying factors that describe the water use conditions might change. Then we're going to, in consultation with our demand expert consultants, try to modify or quantify estimates of what those changes might be. So one thing we think about is like rebound in per capita demand. You know, people talk about it in that kind of setting. Rebounds in per capita demand, we're intending on trying to capture the uncertainty in that by looking at the different changes underlying what drives water use and the effect that it might have. Let me see what else. Your question seems to have moved away here.
Brandon, I think
here it is. You moved it to answered. Okay. And so did we use MWD main in the Urban Water Management Plan and IRP? We used the MWD EDM model, which is a newer econometric model for those to serve the basis of those demand quantifications. And it was last updated in the 2015 time period, but using newer demographics and demographic projections, obviously, for the latest updates.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brandon. Next, Diane Wallace is, her question is, I'm wondering why you're only using member agencies for input. Why would you not seek input from outside agencies with expertise? I'm also wondering about the expertise of the climate experts. Whomever wants to answer, go ahead.
Yeah. So we are seeking input from more than just our member agencies and our board. Just as I mentioned, during the first stage of this in the drivers, with the brainstorming of the drivers, we did hold 2 workshops, public workshops there where everyone was invited to be able to participate in that phase. And we'll continue to do that as we move through the various steps. So we are seeking input from outside agencies. And again, seeking climate change experts and also demand experts input from these areas as well, specifically.
Thanks, Dimitri. So then I'm going to combine a couple here because I happen to know that both Charming and Katie Wagner work with Sierra Club, but I think they're both asking a question about participation. And just for historical perspective, because I've been at this for so long, the very first 1996 IRP, environmental organizations were actually in the room and participating. I'm not sure if that's the time that the live archer came in with quivers of arrows representing the different options, but
you do have a good memory, Connor.
Like an elephant. Anyway, so the question now is, who are the expert consultants that are being added? And as well, there's a question about public participation. Specifically, are any indigenous nations included as experts, environmental organizations? And just how do we all get, we participated in some of the public meetings so far, but as the process moves forward, will there be that same opportunity? Anyone who wants to take it?
So I could talk about who are the experts. So for the demand experts, we have 5. Steve Levy is a demographer from SCAG. We have Kurt Schwabe, who is a professor at UCR. Dan Rodrigo, Lisa Maddows, and Tom Chestnut. Those are basically consultants who are experts in demands. So those are the people who are helping us with the demand experts. So Dan Rodrigo is, Dimitri, help me out. What consultant companies?
He's with CDM Smith.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry. Lisa Maddows with Maddows Water, and then and Tom Chestnut with A&N Technical. And then as far as the climate experts, we have Brad Udall, we have Julie Vano, Heather Cooley, and I'm not sure who the last one is.
The last one's Heidi Roop.
Okay. And I believe Heather Cooley is from an environmental organization.
A research organization, the Pacific Institute. Yeah, so those are well-known names. Thank you for that. Then in terms of being inclusive with both indigenous tribes and environmental organizations, is there an answer to that in terms of input? Anyone can answer.
I think we're having a little bit of maybe specificity in describing what the process is and how folks are being consulted. You had made reference earlier, Connor, to what I think was referred to as the forums that went into the public forums that went into stakeholder forums that went into the 1996 IRP. Our corollary to that now is our public outreach. We had the two public outreach processes on gaining additional input on drivers of change, and we'll continue through processes like this or additional public outreach processes to get input on the process, on the scenarios as they develop and the approaches or portfolio approaches as they develop. And so I'm just drawing a distinction between that type of input versus the direct work that we're doing with the expert consultants that we contracted with specifically for the technical work, or the member agencies that we work with through our member agency technical work group and managers meetings.
So I would only suggest that perhaps you can take back the request of people who are involved and been working on these issues to, as I brought up before, originally in 1996, we were actually in the room with the managers of the water agencies as environmental, the late Dorothy Green, the late David Szymanski, Otis Wolin, myself, and others were actually part of that original discussion when we were talking about the original IRP and others as well. All right, I'm gonna move on, but perhaps we can follow that up with you as well, Brandon. Thank you very much. All right, Valerie asks, are you considering bringing an expert outside review panel to review and provide objective feedback during each step of the IRP?
I mean, I think our board is our expert outside review panel. I mean, in being representatives of our member agencies and our board of directors, I don't, that's not part of the current process, is to convene another outside review panel on each step of the IRP.
That's your final answer? That's fine, thank you.
That's my final answer for now, yeah.
I mean, some of these are, people are asking the question, but also perhaps making a recommendation that you can take back as well. All
Absolutely.
right, now we have someone who was there with us back in this.
Where have I seen this name before?
Yeah, former chairman of the board and still very involved in all of these issues, Tim Brick, who asked, has there been a thorough analysis of the results and program performance of the previous 2015 IRP? Can you summarize the results and what area of improvement are needed?
So generally speaking, on a year-to-year basis, we do provide at least in the years that we're not preparing an IRP, we provide an IRP implementation report, which looks at that very thing. How well are we tracking to the targets that were set in the IRP that's in effect? So that is an ongoing process. And we also just recently prepared and submitted to the board a 2015 IRP retrospective report that looked at, you know, what was assumed in the 2015 IRP and what came out. But I think generally speaking, what we've learned is, and as Nadia mentioned, we can't predict the future. And so what we can do though is expand our thinking on what could you know, what plausible futures we could face going forward, and then see how we can better prepare ourselves to meet the challenges and potentially opportunities in those futures. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've chosen to go with scenario planning. So it allows us, it gives us the opportunity to go through the exercise of thinking about what could happen, not what we think is going to happen, but what could happen, and what are the types of programs and actions we should take to be reliable in those futures. And then from that thinking and analysis, we can better inform our board, who would need to make some tough decisions as to you know, various policy issues that come along with the different scenarios and the challenges and opportunities that are faced in each.
Yeah, and Tim, I just wanted to say hi. It's been a long time since I've seen you, and and also to point out for the rest of the group that that retrospective report that Dimitri was referring to is posted on our website, and so it's a pretty comprehensive review. I think that covers a lot of the areas that I think was in your question. So,
Thank you, Dimitri and Brennan. And I want to say, Tim, that you're alive and well, and I attended the return of Steelhead, Southern Steelhead, to the LA River seminar you all put on, and was impressed by the number of people. So maybe that item will come up in the future as well as we move forward and there's restoration work going on. All right, I've got 2 questions by the next 2 speakers. I'll try to consolidate them a little bit. From David Jordan, wants to know how local stakeholder member agencies will be involved in the local supply refinement phase, and that there's also a lot of competing projects and plans currently. How will they be incorporated into what the Met IRP considers for future actions? I think that's enough for the first question, then I'll read the second one afterwards.
So for the local supply refinement, we're currently in the process of talking with our member agencies, and we're asking their input to basically create scenario-specific project inventory, and so that we can develop new projection methodologies. So we are currently talking to them right now. As a matter of fact, I think we had a meeting with our member agencies last week. So we're starting that process right now.
And we, schedule-wise, we're looking at the next several months to refine the assumptions and then come out with a refined that gap analysis that we're talking about, that looking at the supply-demand gap for each of the scenarios.
yeah,
So that's going to be over the next 2 months.
and I would point out that, you know, with regard to the process, this is the timely part for this refinement with the local stakeholders and the member agencies on local supplies, because really what we're asking them to provide input to is the variability, or the variability in their local supplies, subject to the different conditions of each of the scenarios, which now are being more clearly defined. So that, I think that kind of analysis and data exchange takes place in a much more clear fashion with that scenario framework in place.
Thank you both. So that kind of segues into David's next question, is how do you account for uncertainty in climate change hydrology predictions? California, there's significant uncertainty and variability in atmospheric rivers that can impact local stormwater supplies, as we've seen this year when we've had like nothing and then all of a sudden 2 inches in a single storm.
Yeah, I think, David, that's a great question, and one that we're striving to address both through the use of the scenarios themselves and the input from our expert consultants in the climate area. So our approach here is to try and determine, with input from the expert consultants, what a plausible range of outcomes for the next 25 years in our planning horizon, what that plausible range is for the hydrologic factors that affect our water resources, right? So that, it's a simple question. Obviously, it's going to be a much more complex answer, but in recognizing the uncertainty in the climate change hydrology predictions that come from the different models, et cetera, is to get some guidance on what we should plan for. Because that's really the question that everybody asks of us is, are you planning or accounting for climate change, or what I interpret as potential levels of climate change and its impact on your supplies and demands? And so that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. From Robert McDonald, I have two questions. One is, who are the consultants that were used for the scenario or will be used for the scenario building, and how were they selected? And the second one is, can you share any preliminary parameters about the various scenarios? For example, possible growth of water use from population, industry growth, savings from conservation and stormwater capture, etc.
So I think we listed out, Nadia listed through the experts that we were consulting with to help us refine the scenarios. So I think we answered that. And as far as preliminary results, we're not really quite there yet with the assumptions and the analysis to really come up with results that we're comfortable sharing at this point. What we have done to date is provide some preliminary information, but really it was as an example of the type of analysis that we would be doing. This was just to prime our member agencies and our board about what to expect. But as we go through the next few months here and do the work that we intend on doing as far as refining, we will have that information available for all to review.
All right, thank you very much. From Jim Kennedy, we have, is MWD considering desalination in any of its future water supply? And then the next question from Diane Wallace also refers to a slide that mentions desalination and wants to know if you're proposing for that the cost, environmental impact, and limited capacity.
So I'll just start off and others can chime in, but it's important to remember what the IRP kind of does and what it doesn't do. What it does not do is identify specific projects. It's really looking at actions that we can take, targets, diversifying the different various tools that we have, the programs and things that we can do to be reliable in the various futures. So when in terms of what we'll be able then to do with these scenarios is frame the type of future that we would expect, and that would lend itself to whether or not certain types of projects like desal and other things that are considered more costly would be necessary. In futures that have a very large supply-demand gap, I expect that there will be these unique actions that we would need to take that are not common among the other futures, and that could very well lend itself to pointing towards projects like desal. But we're not quite there yet as far as what the supply-demand gaps look like, and certainly the IRP is not going to identify specific projects, but it will identify the types of things we would need and the level of whether it's a new more additional local supplies needed, a mix of local and imported supplies, and some scenarios might indicate that not much of anything is needed. But again, that's the beauty of scenario planning. It helps us prepare for what could come our way.
Thank you, Dimitri. Is any other comments on that? Okay, moving forward, Katie, wants to know, developing local water supplies is important in some ways independent from the high-low scenarios for project imported supplies, since even if they remain relatively constant in the future, there could be uses for any excess imported water like storage or potentially for other users and uses in the state. Can you talk a little bit more about what the different local water supply project portfolios would look like across the scenarios, or would you be deciding how much to incorporate local?
Would you go ahead, Brandon, and take that one?
Okay, I'd be happy to. So
I
this
guess
is, again, I get excited about talking about this because this is exactly why we are using the scenario planning process. So, in working with our member agencies and looking at their projections of local supplies, what we're really trying to figure out is not necessarily high or low on what those local supply projections are, but how underlying conditions that could occur in the future that we have no control over, those drivers, how they affect both existing local supplies and the potential and the yield for new local supplies. So each scenario will have a tie to the underlying conditions to the local supply production. And then when we look at Nadia talked about portfolios or approaches that we might be pursuing or looking at to address the needs of the conditions in a particular scenario, those same underlying drivers may be a constraining factor on additional development. And so I'll just use like groundwater as an example. Groundwater is at risk from emerging contaminants, right? Something like PFAS can affect the usability of the yield of groundwater. And so in a emerging contaminants future, we could expect that we'd have lower levels of groundwater. How much more? Well, we'll work with our member agencies and the groundwater agencies to try and get a better handle on what that kind of quantification would look like under that scenario should it occur. But in looking at approaches then, our approaches will also be guided by what that underlying scenario is. So in other words, this is, I don't mean this as an actual solution, I'm just coming off the top of my head. Like groundwater storage might not be a good solution for a future where you have groundwater contamination. So and again, that's just an example. Randy, you would probably be looking at approaches to address the groundwater contamination or those emerging contaminants in that future. And then understanding that helps you shape how you go through the future in developing programs and approaches at MET to address those issues. So great question. That's why you heard the excitement in my voice, and Dimitri pointed me out, because that's what I'm most excited about as a planner, is looking at these things.
Thanks, Brandon. We're excited. You're excited about it.
All right. It took 25 years, Connor, but now we're on the same page.
I'm glad to see Grant Hogue is here, and he's asking us, did the future water supply projects include the IRP scenarios with financial and cost implications, or the financial issues excluded from the IRP?
So we do anticipate, to the extent with respect to cost implications, is look at relative among the scenarios, what the relative costs would be within these various targets that we're trying to achieve. So I think we'll be able to do that in the IRP process. But there are other tracks ongoing at Metropolitan that are going to look more specifically at the financial issues.
Thank you, Dimitri. All right, Craig Caldwell from Surfrider South Bay says, how serious will the IRP address the potential for expected DPR legislation that enables direct potable reuse of wastewater for drinking water purposes be addressed as a viable alternative to ocean water desalination projects? Will the IRP address existing recycling resources if utilized at full design capacities, and including future DPR projects such as Hyperion 100% recycling plans be considered for potentially sufficient to offset any needs for ocean water desalination projects?
So Craig, I think this is one of those areas where uh, we started out by saying that the IRP doesn't consider specific projects, right? And that is true, but we do use specific projects where they're available to try and estimate cost parameters or availability. So we go through a great deal of effort to identify like the potential inventory of future projects in the member agency's service areas. We go through a great deal of effort to try and identify what those things are, what they cost, what they might yield, when they might be able to come online, not for the purposes of looking at those specific projects themselves, but for the potential of those projects. So when you talk about something like Hyperion, the information that we have on Hyperion and the kind of, the intention or the possible implementation of something like Hyperion for its cost and its water supply, then can be compared against other categories of water resources that are represented by, desalination as represented by other specific projects, but not necessarily evaluating those specific projects. So how seriously do we address this? Seriously enough in that we will point out some of those inherent differentials in those different supplies where we can, right? Because there's not the same amount of information that's available. So hopefully that addresses your question.
And our current efforts with our member agencies and tapping into their expertise, we are spending quite a bit of time making sure that the inventory of projects of these existing projects and planned future projects are captured so that we can then, this is what Nadia was talking about, the inventory versus the methodology of projecting how these programs or projects will perform going forward. So we're working closely with the member agencies to capture that. And if I've got the numbers right, I think we've identified roughly 100,000 acre feet of these types of projects. So it's definitely seriously under consideration and incorporated in the IRP analysis.
All right, thank you both. Kitty Wagner, who I happen to know along with Craig Caldewalder, both attend a lot of meetings. Craig at West Basin, Katie does what I used to do, which was, I thought, easier in person, but maybe in today's world, it's easier to do online. She wants to know, in listening to IRP committee board meetings, it sounds like board members desperately wanted to discuss policy in the IRP, but staff wants to give updates. It also seems like a lot of the data for the IRP came from 2013. Is this data you use for the basis of the scenarios publicly available? How can the public learn about the data or be engaged? Without policy inputs from the board, it seems like staff is steering the IRP.
Dimitri and Nadia, why don't you take the data side, and then I'll be happy to address the policy discussion side.
Well, so we do have data available, and we posted that to our website. We should we'll provide you kind of the link, I guess, to get you to that information. But everything that we've provided to our member agencies and our board is available, is my understanding. So we'll provide you that link. Connor, maybe afterwards we can get that to you and you can distribute it if.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay.
We can do that.
Yeah. And so with regard to the policy and the policy discussions, if, as you know, the last two IRP committee meetings have been focused on identifying and discussing the underlying policy that's needed for moving through and ultimately adopting an IRP or an IRP approach. I think, I guess I just see this a different way. I see staff as having introduced and given history on the related policy issues and the related policy needs that have been addressed or shown in previous IRPs for context. And then there's a pretty clear ask by staff and time set aside in the committee for that input and discussion from the board. And I think we've received good input and discussion, particularly on the reliability goal discussion that we had in January. But this week's discussion as well, there were more categories for sure, but I don't think the intention was ever to steer, but more to inform and add information for that discussion. So,
All right, thank you. Robert's back with a question, wanting to know how closely that you are working with Mayor Garcetti's administration and long-term planning for responsible, reliable water supply and demand. And I'll just mention, because it was in an article in the LA Times, there was actually a request from the president of the council, LA City Council, for DWP to come back of what it would look like without Metropolitan Water District. Another example, I live in Santa Monica and we're planning for self-sufficiency in water because of budget cuts. It probably won't be by 2023, but there may be a more general individual cities and water agencies moving for more water independence, and how will you be dealing with that?
So, and Brandon, correct me if I'm wrong, but our interface with the mayor's, Mayor Garcetti's administration would be through our member agency, the Los Angeles Department of Water Department of Water and Power. So presumably, you know, they are the advocate for what the mayor and, you know, what the administration is, where they're heading. So, and we obviously engage with LADWP throughout this whole process.
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we're not working directly with Mayor Garcetti's administration, but in so much as DWP is the representative of the city of Los Angeles, then we are.
And then I guess I added a second piece to that, asking if individual cities or water agencies move for greater independence on their own, how does that play into your planning as well? It would be through the representatives themselves as the Met board members bringing that up?
The Met board members and the staff, I mean, as part of the overall planning process, and, you know, with identifying something like that as part of a planned, you know, change in future demands on Metropolitan, in so much as that affects the overall resource mixes and approaches that we would be identifying, I mean, we would want to know those things.
Okay. So everyone talk to your Met representatives. Martha Davis is back again. Thank you, Martha. The approach you're using to better understand the different drivers impact demand and supplies is good. In order to track the changes, I assume you need to establish a baseline and then look how the drivers could change that baseline. Can you make the EDM, water use factors, available for use? As I recall, one concern is that the 2010-2015 plans was the characterization of the average development footprint that impacts the assumptions about irrigatable outdoor areas. That's an important factor to capture.
Yeah, Martha, again, a great follow-up question there. I think I agree with you. I think it is good, the approach that we're using. Can we make the EDM water use factors available for use? If you would want to refer to it as a baseline, the EDM model was documented in the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan and also in our upcoming 2020 Urban Water Management Plan. Those factors kind of serve as a baseline. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, in so much as the factors themselves, or what we would refer to as the measured coefficients that affect water use, could be considered to be a baseline that's developed off of historical data that the model was fitted on. A forecast using those baseline factors, though, is not necessarily a baseline forecast. It's a forecast based on an assumption of, say, demographics, or in looking at the rest of your question, or say outdoor water use area as estimated by average lot size per member agency. So changing those average lot sizes, or using different inputs for the average lot sizes doesn't indicate a baseline or anything like that. But the model itself and the water use factors, I guess, could be looked at as a baseline. And that's really what we're doing with our expert consultants with regard to the demand model, is how do those things need to change from what it is that we think we know now, from having measured water use from 2000 to 2012. How are things different, and how do we reflect those changes within those water use factors? So it's I agree with you that this is an important factor to capture, and we're working really hard on that.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm seeing pretty much the same people continuing to ask questions, but I'll try to consolidate some of those. But this has been asked before in terms of, from Robert, will any of the scenarios include improving supply to Indigenous people in the spirit of anti-racism, social justice, and reparations? The issue comes up with the legal requirement for consultation with the tribes as well. So anyone's welcome to answer that.
I mean, I believe personally that it's in our mission to address these underlying factors, and has been for a long time. So, it's difficult to answer, will they include improving supply to different areas or different characteristics? We're trying to reflect our basic planning objectives: reliable water supply, affordable cost, environmental concerns, all of those things, in the spirit of providing our service area, which includes all of these different groups, the access to water supply that meets those objectives. So I guess the answer would be specifically no, the scenarios don't address that, but yes, the approach always addresses that.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry, I've got some background sound I can't get rid of, but I'm going to keep going here. Valerie's, the upvoting seems to work, because I've been waiting to ask this for Valerie, but she wants to know if you are currently considering threats such as PFAS and cybersecurity in your scenarios. I know PFAS were mentioned, but maybe if you could respond to both of those, please.
How do we know that's a real question? That hasn't been hacked. I'm just kidding. That was a cybersecurity joke.
That was a joke.
That was just a joke. Doesn't work as good online.
You have to clarify that. And
yeah. So yes, on PFAS, through look at regulations, we haven't considered cybersecurity in that. As we went through the drivers that affect water supply and demand and tried to identify the supply and demand links, that hadn't come up. That hadn't come up as a significant factor, or a factor that our stakeholders or us had identified.
Okay, thank you. And Ali wants to know how the IRP is considering the impacts of the two conservation bills, AB 1668 and SB 606, which I believe have until 2023 to reduce demand on residential to 55 gallons per day per person.
And that is a great question, and that is something we are grappling with to figure out exactly how we're going to do that. So I'm not sure we have a specific answer for you right now, but it is something that has come up, and it's something that we need to address and recognize that it is an important factor and driver for demands going forward.
Right.
To the extent that how the range of impact, or how it will impact demands, we are currently thinking through and working with our experts and others to figure out the best approach and the most appropriate way to incorporate it. And I think, again, the beauty of scenario planning is that it allows us at least one scenario, if not a few, to explore that and see how those conservation efforts and how the demands would be impacted. So stay tuned. We're definitely in the process of working through all those issues.
Right. To add to that, Dimitri, if I could, that's actually one of the critical questions, is how not to double count some of the impacts that we've been seeing from the reduction in water use and the reduction in per capita water use over the last 5 years, with and making sure that we don't double count those types of water use efficiencies with what is being sought after in, say, AB 1668 and water budgeting of, say, for outdoor water use irrigation budgets. So we don't, so some of those are the same actions. And so that's one of the things we're working with our expert consultants, is to try to figure out what a reasonable quantification is of resulting water demands that reflect some of the impacts of either legislation or water use behavior, frankly. So thanks for that question.
It's an interesting question because it brings in the general trend we've seen since we started working on this. I mean, Pacific Institute's work goes back to 1978, but increases in population, which we initially thought meant increases in demand, have turned not out to be. As it seemed enough to, there's enough waste to counteract that. And so I don't know if maybe we need to have a cup of coffee sometime, see what we really agree on all of this, Brandon. But
right, well, what I would say is, well, first, yes to the cup of coffee. Second, too, we're supposed to go fly fishing, so I still calling you on that, Connor.
For some
and third, it's really, and I appreciate the opportunity to say this again. It's that range in uncertainty of that outcome that we're trying to capture in the scenarios. The whole drive of the scenario planning process was a realization by staff that, look, we don't know what the future holds. With demand forecasting, if you considered demand as being a function of, say, per capita water use and the number of people, think of what it takes and all the uncertainty in getting a perfect demand forecast 20 years from now. You'd have to know the exact number of people, which we don't know. And we'd have to know exactly how much water each one of those people used on average, which we also don't know. That should just tell us that that's a very challenging issue. So we should instead look at what the differences and consequences of being on different ends of the uncertainty scale for both per capita water use and for the number of people are, so that we can try to plan appropriately as we go through that future. So, again, great questions.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a complex issue. Director Swan has asked, if more folks work to be independent from MWD, total MWD demands will decrease, reliability improve, and the cost of water affordability will decrease. Projects plan on several 100,000 acre-feet of new supply. If they're all built, we will strand large amounts of current supply and make water much more expensive.
Yes.
Is anyone a response to that?
Right. Yes. Right therein lies the question with how much local water supply is there going to be there as part of the total mix, and do the underlying drivers in the scenarios give us any additional information, or does it prompt additional discussion with our member agencies in identifying this as an issue and how to best move forward as a region so that we don't make water much more expensive in the future? So, that is the age-old question. It's one thing to work to be independent from Met. It's another thing to have those efforts, thwarted either by budgetary constraints or regulatory constraints or even climate change issues. And if that water is not there, where does the responsibility for reliability fall? At least from a planning standpoint, it falls on Metropolitan as a regional leader in this integrated water resources development to identify our risk to those things.
I think this is a discussion that could go on for much longer, but I've got a few more questions that I'd like to get to, and then we're going to do our wrap up. But Grant Hogue again is asking, at MWD, is LA represented by the City of LA appointed board members, which I believe there's 6 of, or the LA DWP staff?
So I would say both.
Yes.
The more formal level would be they are board. They're appointed to our board. I believe there are 4 seats, if I have that right.
6 at this point.
4 board members. And then certainly staff to staff, we are engaging all the time with various folks from LADWP. So yes, to both, they're represented.
Right.
And that goes the same with all of our member agencies.
Right, and also with the staff efforts, both their LADWP management through the member agency managers process, and their technical staff through the member agency technical process as part of this IRP as well. So 3 different levels really of those things that you asked there, Grant. And Grant, hi, how are you doing?
All right, I've got questions keep coming. So let's see what I can do to consolidate a few of them by Robert, who's asked, can you share some of the preliminary parameters of various scenarios, possible growth of water use from population industry? I think we already talked about that, savings of conservation, stormwater capture. And then tied into that, he wants to know uncontrollable water demand changes or what influences or drivers of responsible changes into the future. And then when we talk about cost, is it strictly construction and maintenance, or does it include environmental and social justice costs as all? So someone can tackle those. Then at this point, I have 2 other questions and a wrap up.
So, maybe I'll tackle part of those, the ones that I think I'm more familiar with. But with respect to what we can control and what we can't control, that is, we're looking at both sides of that. But each phase of the scenario planning process, we focus on different things. So in developing the drivers and the uncertainties that impact us, these are the things that's the uncontrollable side. Those are the things that we want to further investigate and look at the ranges. And that's why they're uncertain, because there's a ranges of potential outcomes. That helps us frame the various futures. That's the one side. And then the side that we can influence, if there are things we can influence, like different actions we can take, different things that we can implement, then absolutely, that comes in when we start identifying the different actions that we would need to take to be reliable in each of these futures. So I hope that answers that piece of your question there. There are a few others.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, that again, that's one of the things that we're recognizing is, trying to step through this methodically in a way to say, what kind of demand changes are coming from, say, water use behavior that might be persistent from the last mandatory reduction period experience or not, right? That's an uncontrollable water demand changes. The amount of water use that people have is, or are going to use, makes a big difference in the total amount of water demand out into the future. So when I say going through kind of in steps, first we need to figure out what the quantification or the risk to changes in that water use behavior might mean, right? So left to their own devices, do the people go back somewhat to their old water using habits or stay where they are? If they stay where they are, then we have less of a need to influence that level of water use, right? For water use efficiency purposes. But if we feel that there are conditions in which people would go back or tend back to old previous water use behaviors, then now that opens the opportunity for us to do education programs, device, end use programs, but to think about it in the realm of this is what will be happening if we don't have some sort of intervention or program to address that. That same quantification works. And so that's what we're trying to do here. One of the things we're trying to do.
Sounds like a great discussion out on a fly fishing stream.
Yep.
Charming asked, if demand is down, population is down, and more water independence by member agencies, is the IRP going to look at reworking the financial model as one of those scenarios?
Yeah, and so we will have a scenario for that. In fact, we have a scenario for that will explore that. The IRP, what it will be able to do is inform our board on, should this happen, these are the types of things that, these are some of the consequences that come out of that. And there may be financial implications. And so that helps inform our board and other folks, other processes that are occurring at Metropolitan, which will look at the financial model and the refinement structure, the rate refinement and all that. So the IRP doesn't do that itself specifically, but it does provide information to help those other folks, both the policy side and the technical side of the folks that put those models together. So I don't know if there's more you wanted to add on that, Brandon?
No, we're good there.
Okay, then the last question I have is from Director Swan, wanting to know if the planned supply materializes, do we need to continue the local project program? And I should have called out the acronym earlier, but can you just give a brief background of what the local program project is?
Right. So, so the LRP, the Local Resources Program, has been Metropolitan's avenue for incentivizing the development and production of local resources, primarily through recycled water and groundwater recovery, but also is expanded to seawater desalination and then looking at incorporating stormwater projects as well in the future. And so we have some steps there. That's the incentive program. We pay a certain amount of incentive to qualified projects for their production of local resources, thereby increasing the amount of local resources that are in the region. That came as a result of the diversification and resource planning goals that came out of the '96 IRP, right? Increasing the proportion of local resources was part of our preferred resource mix and resource strategy. Peter, you're asking, again, I think one of the key questions here is, the simple answer is, if plant supply materializes on its own without intervention or incentive from that, do we need the local projects program for new projects, right? I would point out that the existing projects, some have contracts that are extending over 25 years now. So we're going to continue to participate through those contracts that were already signed. But so the question is, over 25 years for new things, if plant supply materializes without that intervention, do we need to continue the local projects program? Well, that answer would be probably not. But if it doesn't materialize, and it's in our preferred strategy to continue to develop those local resources, then the answer would be yes, we would. And the rub is, we don't know what future is going to unfold. So the trick is, how do we look at our resource investment programs, our race and revenue balances, our decision-making processes for specific projects or programs? How do we look at those things so that they can be adaptable through time to put Metropolitan and its region in the best position given that uncertainty? That's, so again, that since this is the last question that's up there, that gives me a chance to crystallize again. The scenario planning process, we feel, gives us a chance to look at and expose the information and the uncertainties that we might be facing, so that those policy decisions can be made in light of those in light of those uncertainties and information.
Well, I want to thank all of our presenters and resource people for all the questions that were answered. This is a complex issue, resource planning in general, in a rapidly changing world with climate change and social issues, some of which are unpredictable, some of which we can see happen over time. Demand is down. Last I heard, there's still a fair amount of supply and storage, but looking out into the future is very challenging. I think the governor's supply resiliency portfolio listed so many options, but without any real prioritization. I think that's a lot of people's concern. But I want to thank everybody again, and everybody who participated, those who asked questions, those who listened. This dialogue, the PowerPoints will be on our SoCalWaterDialogue.org, as have been past ones. The Zoom webinar is recorded, and we will continue to be on the fourth Wednesday of the month, except in August, November, and December. If you have ideas for future meetings, please get back to our steering committee or any of us through email, and we each month plan for the next 2 months ahead. So I want to thank everybody who put this together and everyone who presented and everyone who asked questions. This is an ongoing discussion that will continue long into the future, and we look forward to the future meetings, and we can post those. And I will say, in full disclosure, MWD did come to our Green LA committee that meets monthly as well, and gave this presentation, an earlier version of it as well. We meet tomorrow. We'll discuss this and we'll get back to you as well. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.